Detectives say a former NFL player used ChatGPT for advice after killing his girlfriend, allegedly. Darron Lee is charged with first-degree murder after his girlfriend's body was found last month in Tennessee. Now, prosecutors are presenting evidence, including body camera video and questions they say he asked ChatGPT.
On the morning of February 5, 2026, emergency responders were dispatched to a quiet residential neighborhood in Altoona, Tennessee, a suburb just outside the city of Chattanooga. The call that came in reported that CPR was already in progress at a home in Hamilton County. When deputies from the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office arrived at the residence, they found a scene that would quickly become the focus of a serious criminal investigation. Inside the home, a woman had already been declared deceased. Authorities later identified her as Gabriela Carvalho Perpetuo, a 29-year-old woman who had been living at the residence with her fiancé, former professional football player Darron Lee. Lee, who was 31 years old at the time, had once been one of the most recognizable young defensive players entering professional football. In 2016, he was selected in the first round of the NFL draft by the New York Jets as the 20th overall pick. Over the course of his career, Lee played for multiple teams in the National Football League, including the Kansas City Chiefs and the Buffalo Bills before his professional career ended after the 2020 season. But on that February morning in Tennessee, his football career was no longer the focus. The attention of law enforcement was now centered on the circumstances surrounding the death of the woman inside the home. According to investigators, deputies responded to the residence after receiving the call reporting CPR in progress. When officers entered the home, they found Gabriela Perpetuo already deceased. At the scene, Lee spoke with responding deputies. According to an arrest affidavit later filed in the case, he told investigators that Perpetuo may have fallen in the shower. That explanation was documented by officers. But as investigators began examining the home, they quickly noticed details that did not appear to match that description. Authorities reported that there were extensive amounts of blood located in multiple areas throughout the residence. According to investigators, the presence of blood in different parts of the home raised immediate questions about what had happened inside the house before deputies arrived. Detectives began securing the scene and obtaining a search warrant to conduct a more detailed examination of the property. As crime scene investigators moved through the residence, they documented physical evidence that suggested significant violence had occurred. Investigators reported blood evidence on flooring, walls, bedding, and inside the master bathroom of the home. According to testimony later presented in court, cleaning supplies were also discovered in unusual locations throughout the residence. Detectives noted that some areas appeared to have been cleaned, even though forensic testing later confirmed the presence of blood stains. Authorities described this as possible evidence that attempts had been made to remove or conceal blood evidence from the scene. During the initial investigation, law enforcement also examined the body of Gabriela Perpetuo for visible injuries. According to the arrest affidavit, investigators documented several forms of trauma to her body. These included a stab wound to the abdomen, an apparent human bite mark, bruising and swelling around both eyes, and dried blood on her face and neck. The affidavit also described a large bruise on her head and signs of severe swelling around the eyes. Detectives recorded these observations as part of the evidence collected during the early stages of the investigation. While deputies were still processing the scene, Lee himself was also examined for injuries. Investigators reported that Lee had cuts on his hands, a wound on his chest, and a facial injury. According to testimony later presented in court, authorities considered those injuries to be consistent with a violent struggle. The presence of injuries on both the victim and Lee became part of the evidence investigators documented as they worked to determine what had occurred inside the residence. Following the initial examination of the crime scene, Gabriella Perpetue's body was transported for an autopsy. Hamilton County Sheriff's Office Detective Brian Lockhart later testified in court that he was present during the autopsy examination. During that examination, additional injuries were documented by the medical examiner. According to testimony presented in court, Perpetue had suffered severe brain trauma and a broken neck. Investigators also confirmed the presence of multiple stab wounds. Prosecutors later explained that additional stab wounds were found on her legs while she was wearing pants that did not show any cut marks. According to Hamilton County District Attorney Cody Wamp, this detail suggested the clothing may have been put on after the injuries occurred. Based on the injuries identified during the autopsy examination, investigators determined that the potential manner of death was blunt force trauma homicide. However, at that stage in the investigation, the final autopsy report had not yet been released. As detectives continued reviewing evidence collected from the home, additional items were documented during the search. According to the affidavit, investigators found alcohol, narcotics, and a firearm inside the residence. Authorities also reported that blood was discovered inside the case of Lee's cell phone. Each of these pieces of evidence became part of the investigation being assembled by law enforcement and prosecutor in Hamilton County. As the investigation progressed, the events of February 5 began forming a clearer timeline. Authorities made a decision that would move the case into the next phase of the legal process. And by the end of that week, the former NFL linebacker, who had once been drafted in the first round of professional football, was now facing one of the most serious charges in the American criminal justice system. The death inside that Ooltewah home had become the center of a homicide investigation that was only just beginning to unfold. The days following the discovery of Gabriella Carvalho Perpetue inside the Ooltewah home marked the beginning of a rapidly unfolding criminal investigation. Lee was arrested and formally charged with first-degree murder and tampering with or fabricating evidence. The charges were filed in Hamilton County, Tennessee, placing the case under the jurisdiction of Hamilton County Criminal Court. The arrest marked a significant turning point in the case. The former professional football player who had once been selected in the first round of the NFL draft by the New York Jets was now being held in custody while prosecutors prepared to present their case in court. A hearing was scheduled before Torrey Smith, a judge in Hamilton County Criminal Court. During the hearing, prosecutors laid out the evidence that had been gathered by investigators in the days following Perpetue's death. The court also heard testimony from Detective Brian Lockhart, who had been involved in the investigation and had been present during the autopsy examination. According to Lockhart's testimony, the potential manner of death determined during the autopsy was blunt force trauma homicide. While the final autopsy report had not yet been released at that time, the injuries observed during the examination were described as consistent with a violent assault. Prosecutors also highlighted several details discovered during the search of the home. They referenced blood evidence located in different rooms, signs that some areas had been cleaned, and the presence of cleaning supplies near locations where forensic testing later confirmed the existence of blood stains. Authorities told the court that these findings suggested attempts may have been made to clean the scene. Another detail presented in court involved the clothing the victim was wearing when investigators examined her injuries. According to Hamilton County District Attorney Cody Wamp, investigators observed stab wounds on Perpetue's legs even though the pants she was wearing did not have cut marks. Prosecutors told the court that this detail suggested the clothing may have been put on after the injuries occurred. During the hearing, prosecutors argued that the evidence demonstrated a violent attack had taken place inside the home. Wamp addressed the court directly while arguing that Lee should not be released on bond, while the case continued through the legal system. According to statements made in court, Wamp told the judge that Lee had been inside the home with Perpetuo at the time of the incident, and that the evidence indicated she had been severely beaten. The prosecution also presented information about Lee's prior legal history during the hearing. According to statements made in court, Lee was on probation in Florida for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon in one county and battery in another. Prosecutors also said he was on probation in Ohio for attempted batteries. These details were presented as part of the prosecution's argument that Lee should remain in custody while the case proceeded. Defense attorney Mike Little represented Lee during the hearing. Little addressed the court and argued that bond is often set even in homicide cases, including for defendants who have prior felony convictions. However, he declined to provide additional public comments about the case after the hearing, stating that it was too early in the legal process to make detailed statements about the allegations. After hearing arguments from both sides, Judge Tori Smith issued her decision. She ruled that Lee would remain in jail without bond as he awaited further proceedings in the case. The ruling meant that Lee would continue to be held at the Hamilton County Jail while prosecutors moved forward with the next phase of the case. A preliminary hearing was scheduled for March 9, where prosecutors would present evidence to determine whether the case should move forward toward a grand jury. In the weeks leading up to that hearing, investigators continued reviewing evidence connected to the case. Among the items examined during the investigation were digital records recovered from Lee's phone. Prosecutors later revealed in court that investigators had identified a series of messages sent to ChatGPT on February 4, the day before Perpetuo's body was discovered. According to testimony presented during the preliminary hearing, Lee allegedly sent messages to the AI chatbot describing the situation involving his fiancée. One of the messages presented by prosecutors included a statement in which Lee reportedly said that his fiancée had harmed herself. In the message presented in court, Lee allegedly wrote that she had 2 swollen eyes and that she had stabbed herself. The message also reportedly stated that she was not waking up or responding, followed by a question asking what he should do. Another message presented during the hearing involved a question about what to tell a friend who wanted to call police about someone who was unresponsive. Prosecutors argued that these messages suggested Lee may have been attempting to determine how to explain the situation before authorities were contacted. Hamilton County District Attorney Cody Wamp told the court that the messages appeared to show Lee asking the AI system for advice about how to handle the situation. Prosecutors argued that he was attempting to use the chatbot as a source of guidance before contacting law enforcement. The introduction of the messages during the preliminary hearing added a new dimension to the case. Prosecutors told the court that the digital records were part of the evidence they intended to present as the case moved forward through the legal system. The judge ultimately ruled that the evidence presented during the hearing was sufficient for the case to proceed to a grand jury. That decision meant the prosecution would now seek a formal indictment, which would allow the case to continue toward trial. As the courtroom proceedings continued to unfold, the case attracted growing attention from media organizations across the United States. The combination of a high-profile defendant, the violent nature of the crime, and the unusual detail involving messages sent to an AI chatbot brought national attention to the investigation. But for the family of Gabriella Perpetuo, the focus remained on the loss of a loved one whose life had ended inside the home she had shared with Lee for only a short time. And while the legal process was still in its early stages, the evidence being presented in court was beginning to shape the direction of a case that would ultimately be decided in the courtroom. The investigation and prosecution now shifted toward the next step in the American criminal justice system, review by a grand jury. A grand jury's role is to examine the evidence gathered by prosecutors and determine whether there is sufficient cause to formally indict a defendant on criminal charges. In this case, prosecutors intended to present the evidence collected during the investigation of the home in Altoona, Tennessee, along with testimony from investigators who had been involved in the early stages of the case. At the center of the prosecution's case remained the evidence gathered from the residence where Perpetuo had been found dead on February 5, 2026. Investigators from the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office had documented extensive blood evidence throughout the home, including blood on walls, flooring, bedding,
Status
and
update on the living room.
inside the master bathroom.
Just finishing
Detectives
swabbing the
also
coffee table.
reported
Found something
signs
near
that
marker
some
03.
areas had been cleaned despite forensic testing, later confirming the presence of blood. During earlier court proceedings, prosecutors also referenced items discovered during the search of the home, including alcohol, narcotics, and a firearm. These items were cataloged as part of the investigative record. Authorities also documented blood discovered inside the case of a cell phone belonging to Darron Lee. Investigators continued to emphasize the injuries observed on the victim's body during the autopsy examination. Testimony presented in court indicated that Perpetuo had suffered severe brain trauma, a fractured neck, multiple stab wounds, and a bite mark. Authorities also documented significant bruising and swelling around her eyes. According to statements made during the hearing, investigators also observed injuries on Lee himself when deputies arrived at the home. Authorities reported cuts on his hands, injuries on his chest, and a wound on his face. Investigators stated that those injuries were consistent with a violent struggle. Another detail presented in court involved the clothing the victim was wearing. Prosecutors told the court that investigators discovered stab wounds on Perpetuo's legs, while the pants she was wearing did not have corresponding cuts. According to Hamilton County District Attorney Cody Wamp, that detail suggested the clothing may have been put on after the injuries occurred. These findings formed part of the evidence prosecutors intended to present as the case continued through the court system. But one of the most widely discussed pieces of evidence introduced during the preliminary hearing involved digital messages investigators said had been sent by Lee on February 4, the day before Perpetuo's body was discovered. District Attorney Cody Wamp addressed the court during the hearing and argued that Lee had been using the AI chatbot in an attempt to obtain guidance about how to handle the situation. Prosecutors told the court that the messages appeared to show Lee asking the system questions similar to those he might have asked a legal advisor. Defense attorney Mike Little responded by stating that it was too early in the case to provide detailed public comments about the allegations. Little continued representing Lee as the case moved through the court system. After reviewing the testimony and evidence presented during the preliminary hearing, the judge ruled that the prosecution had presented sufficient evidence for the case to proceed. That decision allowed prosecutors to bring the case before a grand jury, which would determine whether Lee would be formally indicted on the charges. As the legal process continued, Lee remained in custody in Hamilton County. Earlier in the proceedings, Hamilton County Criminal Court Judge Torrey Smith had ruled that Lee would be held without bond while the case progressed through the courts. The judge's decision meant that Lee would remain in jail while prosecutors continued preparing their case. The charges he faced were among the most serious under Tennessee law. Lee had been charged with first-degree murder and tampering with or fabricating evidence. Prosecutors also stated during court proceedings that the case was eligible for capital punishment, although they had not yet decided whether they would seek the death penalty. For the family of Gabriella Perpetuo, the legal process represented the path toward determining what had happened inside the home, where she had been living for only a short time. Investigators had testified that the couple had been living in the rented residence for about 10 days before the incident occurred. Family members described Perpetu as a compassionate person who had been studying to become a registered nurse. According to statements shared publicly, she had hoped to work caring for infants. Her death had now become the subject of an ongoing criminal case that had drawn national attention. The involvement of a former professional athlete, the details of the investigation, and the introduction of digital messages during court testimony all contributed to the widespread coverage of the case across the United States. But beyond the headlines, the case remained a matter for the courts to decide. Under the American legal system, every defendant is presumed innocent unless proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution carries the burden of presenting evidence and proving the charges during trial proceedings. The defense has the right to challenge that evidence and present its own arguments before a judge or jury. As the case moved forward following the preliminary hearing, the next step would be the presentation of evidence before a grand jury. If the grand jury returned an indictment, the case would proceed toward trial, where prosecutors and defense attorneys would present their arguments in court. Until that process is completed, the final outcome of the case remains undetermined. What is known is that on February 5, 2026, deputies responded to a home in Altoona, Tennessee, after receiving a call reporting CPR in progress. Inside that home, they found Gabriela Carvalho Perpetu dead. In the days and weeks that followed, investigators gathered evidence, prosecutors filed charges, and a court determined that the case should move forward. Now the questions surrounding what happened inside that house, and who bears responsibility, will ultimately be answered through the legal process in the courts of Tennessee.